And we're live.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Lisa.
Hello, Josh. Hello, everyone. Facebook is
Oh,
putting notifications up in front of the video.
as it is wont to do. Um, Wednesday, Dark Ozarks, very interesting noir history, and I think some some issues that if when you start when you start writing headers involving the words historical contextualization and interpretation, it's easy for one's eyes to glaze over and be like, never mind. But
So that's
as
we didn't use those words.
exactly, we won't. I didn't. It was everyone's imagination that I just did. But based on our sort of our teaser conversation on Instagram, this is we got pretty lively over there before the Instagram goblins shut us down for
Yes.
connection issues.
Well,
Mm.
humorous.
It's been a long 2 weeks and it's only been 3 days.
Yes.
But on a serious note, July 21st, 1865. Today is very interesting, and I would say important anniversary date for noir history in the Ozarks, as well as the traditions, the history, and the legend of the Old West. And it took place today in 1865 on the Springfield town square.
Yes. The basically the first infamous gunfight of the West that made Wild Bill Hickok a legend and dispatched Davis Tutt to almost obscurity.
Yes.
But has retained his own infamy because of the bad outcome for him. And it's engendered a lot of, I don't want to say animosity, but heightened discussion among various factions who are either pro Wild Bill or pro Davis Tutt, or differing viewpoints on the accepted facts. It becomes quite interesting.
It does, and I think especially because there's a number of somewhat conflicting accounts.
Yes.
And it is, of course, coming at a time, 1865, immediately post-Civil War. And nominally speaking, Hickok was associated with the Union. Nominally speaking, Tutt was associated with the Confederacy, although the fact that, again, that sort of not 6 degrees of separation, but 0.6 degrees of separation that you saw in the Old West, everyone seemed to know one another, and
everything was compared.
But I think it really speaks to the fact that there were, comparatively speaking, compared to today, very low population on the frontier, and the fact that it was a very difficult time to survive, and you had to rely on a number of people. The sense of the importance, if not the importance of community, certainly the importance of family and the importance of clan, and that Scots-Irish honor that is very predominant and deserves respect, even if it is difficult for some modern people to contextualize.
Very much so. And it's and part of the problem, I think, is with distance of time and for the most part fairly superficial treatment in entertainment and movies and so forth. It becomes kind of one-dimensional, flat for people. And this is a good example where there's just a lot of facets and a lot of interconnectedness involved that you can't just say, oh, it was a fight over a pocket watch, it was a fight over a girl, it was a fight over a horse, there's a fight over a poker game. Various things came to a head that kind of set this on a path that once it started, it was going to end in a gunfight one way or another.
And those varying accounts, I think it is very easy for folks to pick one of the accounts and settle upon that, when in reality, I think the best that we can hope for is to give all of the accounts space to breathe, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
And at some point, and I think that this goes against our nature of wanting to tie things up in a neat and tidy bow at the end of the narrative, that at some point we have to say, here are, and I think that this goes for so many things, not obviously just this gunfight. This gunfight is a microcosm of really the personal stories of so much of the Civil War, which vastly impacted the Ozarks, but then not just the Civil War, and it extends into contemporary events, it extends into paranormal, it extends into ufology. That the best that we can hope for is really a lack a lack of complete resolve, and you can objectively place a number of facts, then you can objectively place a number of the conflicting narratives, and at the end of the day, you have to let the viewer or the reader look at that information and make up their own minds.
Exactly. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think we've kind of gotten to a point in time in looking at things that we want the sort of the definitive answer for everything.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there isn't. I mean, this is a good example. You had two men who were friends. There's no doubt about it. I mean, Hickok spent time at Tutt's home in Yellville at times. I mean, they knew each other well. There's circumstantial evidence, speculation that Davis Tutt, by the end of the war, was working for the Union through the Provost Marshal's office as basically a double agent. And so even if you want to say, well, it was simmering, feelings from the war, it's not quite that simple there either. And you have to look at it. If you have a close friend, is it just one thing that's going to make you end up challenging a good friend, to a duel, knowing that one of you is likely to die? It's usually not that simple.
Mm-hmm.
We often land on it has to be, a romantic, triangle or something, something very impassioned. And while those factors were involved here, it's not really likely that that's the ultimate motivating factor.
Or the single, certainly
Right.
the single. And something that really strikes me, there's some discussion that David Tate was working as a spy, as a double agent. And I would be very interested into digging more into this. In, I believe, 1863, Alf Bolin was killed by a man who was also essentially a spy, a Union soldier who was posing as an injured Confederate soldier trying to get home in the South.
Mm-hmm. Well, and if there was going to be someone that potentially could play that role well, it would have been Tutt. I mean, his family was from Arkansas. He served in the
Mhm.
Confederate Army. Their leanings definitely were Southern. But I think it's important for people to remember too that there were people with Southern leanings that were Union supporters.
Yes, and vice versa, which really speaks to the complexities of the war, and
Mhm.
in this particular regard, I think even now it's really difficult for us to, again, we have certain images in our head brought to us mostly through media of, again, the past 60 years, certain images that that may be, for example, very flat in comparison to the reality. They may be a pastiche of the history, or they may be accurate, but only accurate within a narrow context.
Mhm. Exactly. And so when you start dissecting the situation that led to this, I think one thing that's telling that, um, of course, we presented in media with the iconic, call out, walk down gunfights.
Hmm.
Um, it's what, I mean, it's the subtext that we all know. Um,
Yes.
and that did happen. Um, However, what most people don't realize is that it happened. Basically, they were on the square 3 times before they ended up coming to blows
Hmm.
that day. Neither, I don't, I think it's fair to say neither one of them wanted this. Um, but they didn't figure out a way to get out of it without losing, hate to say even losing face, because I think it was a little more than that for them. It was losing credibility with the town and their sense of honor. And that
Hmm.
in a much different kind of sense of honor than we would have today.
Yes.
I think it's important to note, if the same thing happened today, Wild Bill would be in prison. I mean, that's, long and short.
Yes. Yes. And he was he was acquitted and
Mhm.
then left Springfield.
Yes, he left. Well, and then he actually ran for city marshal shortly after the fight, and got very few votes because people were afraid he'd be a hothead.
Hmm.
And so
Can't imagine where they got that idea. Yeah.
that's when he went west and ended up in Abilene, and
Hmm.
the rest is history.
Yes. So one of the I believe Harper's publications at the time
Hmm.
began to cover um, Hickok, and
Yeah, they sent out a reporter, and I think initially, from everything I've read, they sent out originally, they were looking for stories sort of out on the frontier, especially because they'd made their money for 4 years selling war stories, battles.
yeah.
So they needed something new. And so this reporter ends up in Springfield, and just shortly after this big event, people are still talking about it. So he interviews people, and he interviews Wild Bill, who, um, by all accounts, over his life, um, he talked a good game. He was smart, and he spun it well too.
Mm.
And so, um, by the time the story got back to New York on the Telegraph, and published, he was on his way to being the first legend of the Old West,
Yes.
rightly or wrongly.
Very fair. And it does. mm, I think that, contextually, I think that there's a really interesting, lessons to be learned. Obviously, one is, if you're in a gunfight, don't be the one who gets shot. But second, make sure that you have a great PR guy.
Exactly. Even if you have to do it yourself.
Yeah.
And
Um,
But and it's not isolated. Another example is Jesse James. I mean,
Mhm.
newspaper editor. I think it was one of the Kansas City papers. Um, got rather enamored with him, and he's the one who basically created the version of Jesse James that people know as the Robin Hood character.
Yes.
So
Mhm.
that happened.
It did, and something that again, and mm, we've already discussed this, but I'm going to bring it up again because I think it's valid, but also because I want to. Uh,
There.
is that that there's again, the best that we can hope to do is share the varying narratives,
Mhm.
and share those narratives with a great deal of respect. I think that whether it's a medium like this or whether it's the written word, that something that goes a long way in helping us maintain culture is allowing is doing our best, earning our place through doing our due diligence and then stepping away.
Yeah.
That it's, like for our discussion, that there's going to be, for example, pro Davis Tutt factions today, comparatively small factions, but important. There's going to be Wild Bill Hickok factions.
Mhm.
And then there's going to be a lot of the public that is just now learning that, that someone named Davis Tutt lived
Mhm.
and died ultimately in Springfield, and that that Wild Bill Hickok is not is actually a real person, was a real person, is not some sort of old west 1950s TV pastiche that went out
Yeah.
of style at some point, and that the best that we can do is honor the varying narratives, place them out there, and and celebrate the fact that at the end of the day, a great deal of, I would consider, regardless of what side anyone was on, that these men and women in the first case in the Ozarks frontier, but in the American frontier or within this larger um, story, this narrative of history, that they lived and they died and their lives meant something.
Exactly. Exactly. I think sometimes the debates get very caught up in specific details, and that we had a post on the page this
Mhm.
morning about the anniversary, and some of those came up.
Yes,
Um,
yes, and I think
and
they're
I'm not sure
interesting.
the people involved in those debates necessarily like what I'm about to say, because and it's not dismissive. Don't mean it that way. But some of the small the arguments often come about over small details. Who shot first? Did, you know? Um,
It was Han.
huh?
It was Han. Han shot first.
Oops, different movie. Yeah. Well, I mean, in some ways, you can. I mean, in some ways, that scene in Star Wars is you could argue that it's a retelling of this story, and I think that's one thing
Mhm.
that's important to say. It's this story has been retold in various forms so many times, with so many characters that we aren't even aware of it.
Agreed.
You know,
Agreed.
and
The the motif of the American West is archetypal,
mhm,
and it has encircled the globe in its imagery and its power.
yes, It really has. And it, one of the disputes today, as an illustration, that I find really interesting, because in the court, in the scheme of things, it doesn't make much difference, is arguing about, did Wild Bill aim between the pistol on his other forearm, or did he aim putting it on a hitching post?
Yes.
And what various witnesses said, and there were accounts both ways,
Right.
especially over time. And some of it, the accounts kind of changed over, as people got older, and it became a bigger story and it became embellished. And I look at it and I say, it really doesn't matter. He steadied the shot. And some people were commenting that made Hickok a bump, somehow, that he cheated by doing that. But that comes from the lens of our perception of the Old West in movies, etc. In reality, that was a very common technique, particularly in the war. It was used, particularly if you were on horseback.
Mm-hmm.
That you steady the shot. And anyone that was a writer, anyone that was fighting in that war, would have been very familiar with the technique. And I kind of look at it, it was probably, it could just as easily been Tutt who did the same thing. But in the end, what really just matters as far as the narrative goes is we know the outcome. Two men shot, one missed, and one didn't.
Yes, and especially for the weapons technology at that time, a heck of a distance.
Yeah, 75 yards, with either a dragoon pistol, or maybe a Colt Navy. That's even disputed as to which, what gun was used. And again, either one, it's a heck of a shot. And basically he shot him through the heart.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the real thing to ponder is, it just as easily could have gone the other way.
Yes.
They both were dangerous men with guns.
Yeah.
And a lot of people have said that Tutt was actually the better shot.
Wow. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting when you stand on the Springfield Square, as I've done many times, and of course we filmed on the Springfield Square a year and a half ago. So many changes have been made to the square. There's been a variety of iterations. You stand in front of what is today Coffee Ethic, which is a great place to get an espresso macchiato, and it is so. The Old West past and the Ozarks frontier feel very far removed from that location.
I think so. Yes and no, but it's, I think in part of it being the open square, it's still, there's something about that open square that just is evocative of another time, because we're not used to that. Most, small town squares usually have a courthouse in the middle.
True.
And so it has that different feel for that. But there is the details definitely are very contrasting. You look at the old Hearst department store, which is, I can't even remember how long it's been empty now, 40 years. And that was the site of the courthouse at the time of the shootout. And Tutt stood in front of it. And when he was shot, he said, "I'm killed, boys," and basically took a few steps and fell over at the steps of the courthouse, which had been used as a Army hospital during the Civil War. But you can still see all that. But I think it's kind of interesting when you really think about it, and we talk about things replaying, is that you go back 29 years before to the first murder in Springfield, it happened on the same corner.
Yes.
And
Very, very interesting.
yeah, and ironically, again, it involved two people that had history. It was a little more complicated. It wasn't that one-dimensional good guy, bad guy from the movies, but it did involve a judge. The first murder in Springfield was committed by a judge sitting, who was a judge at the time. Although he was acquitted based on self-defense. And if you want to go by connections, the man he killed, well, the judge was, for anyone interested, was Charles Yancey, killed John Roberts, who owned a mill and was pretty prominent in business, so forth. But he had a vendetta against Yancey because he had ruled against him in the case. And then even prior to that, he had represented someone that he felt had wronged. Yancey had represented a guy that Roberts felt had wronged him. So he had bad blood for quite a while. And once Yancey ruled against him in this court case, he taunted him. He would follow him around, taunting him, etc., and make allusions to threats that he was going to do something. And that particular day, they met on the corner, and Roberts reached in his coat, and Yancey thought he was reaching for a gun, and he shot him. He was actually reaching for his eyeglass case. But then if you want to say, how are all these odd things connected to? You want to go back just a little bit further. Year before that, and Roberts, who's now dead on the sidewalk, had been the foreman on the jury who convicted Wilson Eidson, who is the first man who spent time in the Missouri State Penitentiary.
It's a very small world.
Very small.
Something that, and of course, any of our cities have these sorts of very interesting histories. Springfield, has gone through many iterations. Springfield, Missouri, has gone through many iterations. There's a lot of cultural facets that, especially springing from the Civil War, that are oftentimes overlooked. It's easy to get distracted by the franchise restaurants and the 4-lane roads, and something that I'm consistently very interested in. I'm looking forward to exploring more is the urban Ozarks. Folks associate the Ozarks with rural life, and certainly we have a lot of that, and we explore a lot of that, and that's been the case for and our, of course, accessing our beautiful natural resources, the mountains, the rivers, the lakes, that sort of thing. But there are a handful of notable cities with history dating back to prior to the Civil War, Springfield being one of the largest. And there's some very interesting and some very dark at times history throughout that.
Yes, much more so than you would think of going to the movies and going out for a nice Mexican dinner or whatever. So.
Mexican Villa all the way.
Oh, I have to tell you later, I happened upon a recipe that matches their queso back in the day.
Oh my God. Okay, that's important. That's very important. And speaking of, just in terms of contention, I feel like Mexican Villa is one of those things that really evokes a high degree of contention that of course it's historic, and folks either I haven't found a lot of people who feel sort of middle of the road about Mexican Villa. It's either
Yeah.
you really like it or you really don't. I, for myself, really, really like it. So
I do too, and I associate it with a lot of good times when I lived there because I, ended up eating there probably once a week with friends. And so, and just an example, made this queso dip this weekend and tried it, and it was just like a light bulb goes off. It was like you're sitting in Mexican villa, and I kind of had the same thought because I know people who just don't like it at all, but for me, it's very nostalgic, and I do like the food. Don't judge me if you don't like it. Too
yeah,
bad.
and and I think I think what's interesting is this particular case, and we're gonna have to like get together at Mexican Villa, um,
Yes.
and and because it is a very evocative and nostalgic
Mhm.
place. It is a part of Springfield history, has been for a very long time. Especially the location downtown north of Mercy.
Mhm. Mhm.
That's that
Yeah.
one's that
Yeah.
that one
One at Bennett or whatever. Yeah.
that was probably my favorite, but they're all good. Um, but attaching contextualization, attaching preconception, attaching expectation onto this. So for people who might be outside of Springfield or unfamiliar, it is a Mexican restaurant that you cannot get fajitas at.
Yeah.
There is a very specific menu, and my basic, the only way I've really been able to describe it to people is imagine um, Mexican food in a 1950s diner.
Mhm. I think that feds it. I really do. That's it in a nutshell.
And just all of the things that one comes to expect from a Mexican restaurant in terms of fajitas or salsa fresca or salsa verde or flan or all of these things. It's not there. It's not
No,
going to be there.
no.
It's like going to a 1950s made right diner except with tacos and enchiladas.
Yeah.
And and it is so good and so much fun. And one small plate is an enormous serving worth thousands of beautiful calories.
Yes.
So
One plate's enough to serve a small family. So
it's glorious. So that's our unpaid plug for Mexican Villa. We love you. Um, but just the contextualization, I think, is crucially
Mhm.
important. Understanding, and I love fresh fajitas as much as anyone can, but I know that contextually, there's plenty of places that we can do that, but there's only one Mexican Villa. Uh,
Yeah.
so, and I think approaching Ozarks history or history as a whole is the importance of being willing to embrace it for what it is and not what you expect it to be.
Exactly. Exactly. Um, you just have to go with it and accept what you find.
Mhm.
And sometimes it's, more fun than you thought, or sometimes it's not quite as uh, exciting, or maybe it's more dark than you thought. And you just have to go with
Yes, it's and and also, and we talked about this earlier, but the importance of getting out of our preconceptions, but the fact that many of our preconceptions are really uh, planted in our heads by mass media, and
it.
the idea that we can get into those expectations. For example, seeing the Old West, and the Ozarks was a seminal point of the Old West,
Mhm.
and this shootout, of which we're marking its anniversary date today. This shootout was a seminal moment in Old West history that has since been revisited and recontextualized and rewritten in terms of the narrative countless times. whether it was, in um, you know, uh, TV shows in the 1950s, or films in the 1960s, or even, interestingly enough, as we already mentioned, in 1977, the Western motif and the archetypes that were built into the first Star Wars film.
Exactly. I mean, uh, because that's exactly what it was, dressed up differently. And we don't accept, we don't think about those things. And I think I think it would be interesting if if you had Hickok and Tutt standing in front of us right now, they'd probably be going, that's not how it, that's no, that's not what happened. Or no, that, you know, or they just be laughing. I almost envision that, that, um, you know, but, everyone is, has put their spin on it. And I think it's what it's kind of like having a favorite genre of book or a favorite genre of movie. You have people who focus on the politics, and they were on different sides of the war, or whether it was over the women, or the poker game itself, um, uh, or the horse, that Hickok had bought from Tutt, and then Tutt had other debts that were coming due, people pressing him, he needed that money. And one version is they were just arguing about how much did Hickok still owe on the horse.
Mhm.
Some people say, well, it was the watch, because it was his father's, and um, it wasn't even the watch. Some people say there was a picture of his mother in there, which was probably the only picture he had. And none of that really makes sense for two friends to end up on the square 3 times in one day, and ultimately in a fight. Um, you know, I don't really think it had anything to do with the watch. I don't think it really had probably that much to do with the poker game, because they had Tutt had borrowed money from Hickok. Hickok had, they had gone back and forth. Um, I think it was the combination of those, of everything. And I think Tutt needed money right then. And once it got started, neither one was going to back down, because each step forward meant, if you back down, who was going to be called a coward?
Yeah.
In 1865, Springfield, edge on the frontier, was not a place you wanted to be known as a coward.
And in contextualizing that, being known as a coward could be more dangerous than facing up in a gunfight.
It could be. Well, and of course, there's always a chance that you're both going to miss anyway. But yeah,
Yeah. And for people who are, might be unfamiliar, I'd challenge people to pace out 75 yards just to get an idea of what a heck of a shot that was.
yeah. And they don't portray that in the movies. It's uh, and it's a heck of a shot with weapons that weren't nearly as accurate as pistols now. And probably just ultimately, that sense of bravado, that I can't back down once the gears got rolling and everything was in motion.
Yeah. Yeah. It's the first takeaway for me is that it's a complex narrative. The second takeaway for me is how important it is to remember both of these men.
Exactly. I look at it, and I look at Wild Bill. Was he an interesting person? Was it fascinating character? Yeah. I look at Davis Tutt, who not as well known by the general public, but equally interesting story. And
Mhm.
um, you just have to wonder, if it had come out the other way, would he be a household name the way Wild Bill ended up?
Right. The idea that it's not impossible. It is. it's so interesting to conjecture. Of course, in terms of the Harper's article, if Tutt had been the survivor, it can be assumed that he would have been interviewed and featured in Harper's,
And
probably
I'm
later
sure
that
fun
year.
way that Wild Bill did.
Yes, yes. Um, the one thing that, and I obviously, for obvious reasons, know less about Tutt, that Wild Bill seemed to have um, a knack for spinning his experiences
Mhm.
that that may that may have set him apart, um, across the board. And
Right. I mean, and that is part of it that we don't like to admit. We like to think that everything's cut and dry with history, but it's not. And if you didn't have someone spinning it, um, yourself or someone else, that the story could come out a lot different.
very,
And
very different. Yes.
so, but I think the
Um,
long and short of it is, it's a day just to remember that Ozarks played a large part in the creation of the Old West myth, and some of the iconic images of the Old West started on this day in 1865, for better or worse, with the outcome. Um, and that no one involved was perfect. And I'm sure if they could have figured out a way to get out of it and not uh, risk being called a coward and what that implication might be, it wouldn't have happened.
yes, agreed. And that in certain circles, the debates about the narrative are going to continue.
Mhm.
And I think that at the end of the day is a good thing, because it means that the memories of, first of all, that these two men, but through them, the memories of so many individuals of American history are in some way remembered.
Exactly. A lot of people whose names are not remembered, but in some small way their lives and deeds um, uh, mattered and contributed to that larger narrative.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's what counts. I think history and the ensuing arguments in regards to the sides and the nuances of history, all of that, we have to regard that entire collective with a great deal of honor.
Yes, and
It's from whence we came.
it is, and it affects our views of society and interactions with other people in ways that we really aren't conscious of all the time.
No, and for I think while there's certainly no guarantee that history will remember us kindly, the best that we can do is remember our own pasts with as much respect as possible.
Exactly. Now then, for the rest of the conversation,
Yes. Oh, which direction would you like to go?
I don't know. You had thrown out how I'm trying to remember how you worded it now.
Me too.
It's been
It
a
was
long
like,
day.
it's been like,
We started this
oh,
conversation too early, I guess.
I
Um,
think so.
but the these same kind of themes follow through in other kinds of stories, whether it's the noir history like the Shootout, or legends, or um, ghost stories, or cryptids, or whatever.
Yes,
I think basically these same issues come into play.
they do. So yeah, thank you. I remembered what I was going to say. Uh,
Glad I
this,
could help.
me too. That So these will, take these original events in 1865. We have conflicting but comparative narratives dealing with what should be a very straightforward situation.
Mhm.
We have a number of eyewitnesses who have differing accounts, and then we have a sudden blossoming of media
Mhm.
to give more varying accounts, and then it spawns its own conceptual genre afterwards. And in that situation, of course, my background as a journalist, your background as an attorney, we've also know the unreliability at times of the first person account.
Yes. Yes. Unfortunately unreliable as far as remembering details. Um, the old adage, you can put 100 people in a room and someone walk in and shoot someone, and you're going to have 100 different versions of what happened. And I think the Tutt Hickok fight is a good illustration of that. Um, but it's the same issues no matter what you're looking at. Trying to figure out, are there facts that are not in dispute, and those that are, or accounts that are different, looking at them from all sides and with due respect. Because a lot of truth is subjective. We don't like to admit that.
Yes. And and we see the same. I've had the opportunity to visit with a number of folks in several UFO conferences in the Ozarks, and it's much the same, that there are some, in the case particularly of aerial phenomena,
Mhm.
that there is some of that aerial phenomena, there is some phenomena that is
Mhm.
is documentable, and people can be as skeptical as they would like, but the reality is that documentably these things happened.
Mhm.
And what what it is about these things, or how these things, or why these things, is very much open to interpretation at the moment, but the fact that it happened is oftentimes not.
Right.
But then you begin talking with various factions within,
Mhm.
for example, the ufology, the UFO community. And for me, what I seem to see, and I got corrected on this, by someone when I gave this lecture, um, but the approximate factions in terms of the community, I feel, are one, individuals who are simply interested in recording the phenomena,
Mhm.
uh, documenting the phenomena. They're very quick to say, I'm not going to put an interpretation on the whys or the hows. I'm simply interested in the reports.
Right.
And the second faction tends to be that the phenomena is associated with extraterrestrial or alien intelligence, and that the bulk of that intelligence is uh, um, highly sophisticated in terms of its technology and in terms of its physiology, and that their interaction with human beings, oftentimes telepathic, is and oftentimes associated with a wide range of what I would consider to be associated phenomena,
Mhm.
is largely benevolent. That it's an attempt by extraterrestrial life forms to elevate human consciousness and help us create a better world. And then the third faction is one that based on their interpretations and their experiences, that the alien life forms in question are very negative, and very dangerous, and that they do not mean humanity, uh, uh, you know, positive things, and that they're here very much at our peril, and there's not a lot that we can do about it. And those three camps, and I've sat down with lengthy interviews or sat through lengthy lectures from individuals of all three camps. And my
We lost sound.
experienced it.
Sound just cut out for a second.
Okay. I'm very fascinated by UFO phenomena and theories and ideas, but I've never personally experienced anything of that nature. And as a sort of a journalist who's green, initially very green to the communities, it really pushed me in terms of having to do a lot of soul searching to say, how do I write these stories? How do I represent this that is fair to the larger world, is fair to these various communities? And at the end of the day, what I finally landed on was the best that I could do is simply fairly represent the various factions, and as um, to quote the Oracle from the Matrix, um, let everybody make up their own damn mind.
Exactly. And I think that's what you have to do. And a lot of people are uncomfortable with that because they do want an answer. And maybe the answer, they want it just because they want to know, can I close my eyes at night and not worry about something,
Mm-hmm.
happening?
And I think that's I respect that desire. I
Oh yeah.
I want that as well. And certainly a number of people in the UFO community have had exceptionally unsettling experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And I deeply respect that. I also got a strong sense that a number of people were very hesitant to talk to media because they were afraid of being portrayed as crazy. And that was, I think, one of my greatest takeaways was that the individuals who had extraordinarily unsettling experiences, that it was very isolating for them.
Yes. I think that the best thing I can say for me, it actually comes from my profession as an attorney. I had to learn over time um, that, and this works for me, so may not work for everybody, but my goal, and I strive for, is not to be judgmental.
Yeah.
Because even in situations when you believe people, as far as this is, their account is fairly accurate. There's a lot of situations where it's easy to say, why did you do that? Or how did you allow this to happen? A good example of that is domestic violence. You get a lot
Yes.
of people that are very judgmental about, why did you stay, or how could you let that happen, or this or that. And over time, you learn you can't really be judgmental, because until literally, walked that mile, um, you can't really say you would do this or that.
No.
And you get to a point where you accept that different people's reactions in a difficult situation can be valid. Society
Yeah.
may have certain standards. Oh, this is the perfect way to deal with it, or this is the worst, or whatever. But people really don't operate that way. We aren't made up that way. We react based on our collective experiences over a lifetime. And we tend to, and I think this works with the UFO community as well. And we tend, what I found, people tend to react based on what they learned as a child. So
Hmm.
what they saw growing up is what we tend to revert to as adults when we were placed in a stressful or a bad situation. And so,
That's very insightful.
I mean, that's just been my observation. And so to be judgmental about it is not really fair, because you can't go back and undo all of that. But you, if you can understand why someone reacts the way, you can
Hmm.
accept it. You might say, I hope I would have done something different, maybe, but
Hmm.
that doesn't make them less human.
No,
And
and in
I
fact,
that applies with the UFO community. And
mhm,
um, so how people react when they have an odd experience or something that is totally out of the bounds of normal experience has a lot to do with the environment that they were raised in and the tools they were given to react to stressful situations.
yes, and I would posit that those sometimes very difficult to understand responses is actually many times what makes us more human.
Oh, I think so. I think so. It may not be pretty, but it's human.
No, but it's human, and there's several things. I don't know if I will do it justice in terms of tying into that, but several things in my head about this situation, and it obviously associated with UFOs, but also even more so, I think, associated with the various histories or narratives or conflicting narratives that we see with the Hickok-Tutt shootout and a variety of Civil War events and personalities. Coming back to those very personal conclusions, that there is a, in many cases when passions are very high about these events, there's something very personal associated with that.
Mhm.
It's not objective historical analysis. But realistically, at this point, for this person, and I could speak for myself on some of these issues, especially in regards to personal family narratives,
Mhm.
that it's not objective, and from an emotional perspective, it shouldn't be. It is personal, and I think it's important for us to respect that, because, of course, it can get a little emotional and it can get a little crazy at times, and I mean
Mhm.
crazy in the way that I like crazy. um not crazy as a pejorative. I live most of my life somewhere in that space of general crazy. uh but that there's something very personal and there's something very human about that, and
Mhm.
it reminds me, I don't quite understand the analogy that I'm about to make, because it is in and of itself an emotional analogy, but sort of the sense of mm, long-standing family and ancestry and hearth and home, that, and you can know that some of those processes or some of those learned behaviors or habits um, are not necessarily healthy,
Mhm.
but there is a sense there's a sense of tradition, there's a sense of heritage, there's a sense of safety even within that structure, that
Mhm.
that
Yes.
is very personal.
Mhm. There are,
And
yeah, and there are different sets of those sort of family rules, or even community rules that uh, if you see enough of these situations, you see them, but probably 99% of the public would never know exists.
Yes.
Mhm.
And I think when and I think this would be my hope, certainly as we move forward in terms of exploring, noir history especially, but many topics in the Ozarks, that oftentimes those very sort of personal, um internal narratives of whether it's the internal emotional narrative of a community or of a family or of an individual, of which they're very protective of. It seems that oftentimes one of two things can happen when it gets shared into a larger conversation. That either it is exploited, um,
Mhm.
by a larger media narrative. Let's laugh at these people, because they're different than us. And
Turn it to
the
our benefit
Ozark,
way. Mhm.
mhm. And the Ozarks have a long history of that. And I think you could divide the history of essentially hillbilly exploitation into two parts in the 20th century. The first 50 years, with outside voices exploiting hillbillies as lesser people,
Mhm.
with very little, without a narrative response to it. And the second half of the 20th century, and I'm very proud of the fact, whether folks here necessarily fully realize it, but the 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 Branson, hillbilly motif is really a response to that, one of taking ownership of that narrative and repackaging it in a way that the ownership remains here.
Yes.
And I think that's very powerful, but it's very personal. And with that is, so either larger media voices exploiting hillbillies, the hillbilly motif or the personal narrative motif, for profit, or sort of a clinical academic treatment in which individuals' very personal heritages and memories, especially when it goes back to things like the Civil War, are laid out in a very sterile clinical light and then parsed out. And I think it feels like your family is getting, placed on the block, so to speak, in terms of getting served up as some sort of, analysis. and
Yeah.
and that's something that I think you and I are both uh sensitive to and strive to bring, um an Ozarks voice to the table.
Exactly. No, I agree. And um it's definitely an ongoing process too.
It is. It is. And be, a willingness, of course, as the and this is something that I found fascinating. Every time we dig into a subject, more information about that subject typically comes to the table.
Yes. I mean, it's sort of the old adage, uh with writing, writers will say, "Oh my, I've got this great story, I get it done, I won't have anything else to write about." But it doesn't work that way. And it
No,
certainly doesn't when it comes to history and legends and so forth. It seems like, you know, every time you delve into something, there's more layers. And I think that's beautiful, really.
I do too. I do too. And it's the continuing complexity of the human story, to me, is an incredibly beautiful thing.
Hmm. Oh, I agree. And um, it's not, and I think that's one thing, is that it's not static. And maybe that's what we were trying to say about all of this and people's interpretation and being vested one way or another in, say, the Hickok-Tutt fight, is that there's a dichotomy between, you know, the empirical facts of what happened and what does it mean.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think that's the one thing we try to present all sides of what happened or could have happened. What does it mean has to be left to the viewer.
It does. And yeah, in the case of a shootout, you know, the figurative sense of death of the author becomes no longer figurative.
That's true. That is true. That is true.
As an author, I prefer not to, you know, be that committed to my to my work.
Yes, yes. Or the flip side of that is, you know, are you creating a thought form or something? And that's, you know, that's a whole other topic.
Hoodoo and tulpas. It's one of my favorite topics. But yeah.
Mine too. Mine too. And perhaps, you know, in a small way, people arguing about these facts of what happened 156 years ago is exactly that.
Yes.
Creating their own, they are creating their own sense of that history.
Agreed. Which is, and this is something that I also find really fascinating. That process in and of itself is a part of our history.
It is. I mean, it really is. And there's no good way to separate yourself from that.
No, you can, you know, we do our best, I think, to develop awareness of the various preconceptions, the various media messages, the various narratives, you know, the sort of sanitized pastiche of the 1950s and 1960s. TV westerns is a great example.
Yeah.
That it painted oftentimes a very different picture of the Old West than the Old West was, and yet we're now looking back to the 1950s and 60s, and it is, in terms of media and impact upon society, it is itself also history that in time will move into its own era, just as, for example, the 1860s and 1870s of the settlement of the American West.
Well, I mean, I mean, literally, you can look at it and say and take various examples, but perhaps a more mainstream one for people to look at: Greece.
Mm-hmm.
Greece is a representation of the 50s, but not a literal reality of it.
Yes.
And so to the point that the time period that packaged the tropes of the Old West are now becoming tropes themselves.
Yes, and I for one am eagerly not anticipating the nostalgic films of the 2020s.
I'll skip that one.
I'm going to press fast forward on that.
Either that, or I'm still waiting. Maybe the Roaring '20s will kick in yet, like they did 100 years ago. I don't know. And they'll be
Fingers
a little more fun.
crossed. Oh, I'm stocking up on gin. Although there's not necessarily ever a bad time to say I'm stocking up on gin. So there you go.
There you go. Maybe on that note, yeah, we leave everyone pondering there until next week.
I like it. I like it a lot. And of course, we have a Dark Ozarks and event coming up. We should invite everyone to.
Yes, a week from Saturday at the Kendrick House in Carthage. We get to tour antebellum home in the Ozarks that was the site of a lot of history, including Civil War battle. And then Josh and I will be talking a little bit about Ozarks folklore, and then we'll be watching a mystery thriller, The Lost Child, set in the Ozarks, that incorporates folklore.
Yes, I'm looking forward to that. Looking forward to visiting with everyone. Of course, it'll be great to I love our Zoom conferences, but it's really fun when we're actually in the same room.
Yes, we get to prove that we actually can be in the same room.
Yes, we are not actually a digital figment of Facebook's imagination, and
Yeah, sometimes I kind of wonder, are we man's headroom? But
and I think I'll brush off my overalls and my bowler hat for the event.
there you go. You fit right in, and actually be quite appropriate for the evening.
I think so. It's going to be fun. Hope folks can join us for that. And of
Yes.
course, we'll be back here on next Wednesday night with new topics.
Yes, we will. And so we hope everyone has a good week. If you have things you're interested in, let us know.
Absolutely. Appreciate y'all. Appreciate you, Lisa.
Appreciate you, Josh. Appreciate everyone. Thank you all for listening in.
Yep.